When the rain beat against the windows, her tears mingled with the water from the sky. Her hands, once intertwined with his, now only embraced emptiness. In her eyes, the reflection of a broken promise. Isabella knew the weight of silence in a house that no longer breathed love, but sometimes fate arrives with 12 coins and eyes that look without judging. Calloused hands that rebuild fences can also repair hearts. In the whisper of the earth being reborn, she found her own awakening. If this story touched your soul, leave your like as someone who holds the hand of someone who needs to know they're not alone in their pain. And tell us, how do you think this love story that was born from ashes will end? Your story is also part of ours. The western wind drew dust spirals on the Texas horizon, while Samuel Harrison adjusted his horse's reins. At 42 years old, the wrinkles that crossed his weather-beaten face told stories of 15 winters traveling through other people's ranches, evaluating cattle with expert eyes that rarely made mistakes. The sun fell like a copper coin over the plains, and Samuel observed the road with the gaze of one who had slept more nights under stars than under his own roof. The seasons had blurred in his memory, converted into a single dusty path. The faces of the ranchers mixed in his memory, like a blurred mural of hats, handshakes, and contracts, signed in the yellowish light of oil lamps. His life fit in the leather saddlebags that hung on both sides of his mount: 2 shirts, a spare pair of pants, a shaving razor, and a worn notebook, where he recorded figures and observations with precise handwriting. That afternoon, while stopping by a stream so his horse could drink, Samuel extracted from his jacket's inner pocket a yellowed newspaper clipping. He had read it so many times that the folds threatened to break the paper. Property auction. Brazos, Texas. 15 acres with house. Monday, 10 in the morning. There were no more details, just an address and the signature of the regional bank. The announcement, so brief, had captured his attention like no other. Perhaps it was the absence of ornaments, so similar to his own existence, that made him fold it carefully and keep it close to his heart. The horse snorted, lifting its wet head. Samuel stroked its neck with his calloused palm. "Maybe it's time to stop, eh, Thunder?" he murmured, and the animal shook its mane as if it understood. Samuel had never confessed to anyone that fatigue had settled in his bones like a silent tenant. That each new dawn in a different inn weighed more than the previous one. That loneliness, once a light companion, now dragged behind him like a lead shadow. As he mounted again, the sun projected his elongated shadow on the dusty road. A solitary shadow that extended toward the horizon, toward Brazos, toward something he still didn't know how to name. Brazos's plaza was a rectangle of packed earth, surrounded by wooden buildings that seemed to resist time more through stubbornness than strength. The bank, painted in faded white, stood on the north corner like a reminder of who dictated the rules in that region. Samuel arrived 15 minutes early, tying Thunder in front of the closed barber shop. Only 2 men waited by the bank steps, a gentleman in a dark suit with an impatient appearance, and the auctioneer, recognizable by his leather briefcase and striped vest. "Coming for the Morgan property?" asked the auctioneer, raising an eyebrow upon seeing Samuel's dusty clothes. "That's right," he responded, removing his hat out of courtesy. The man in the dark suit looked at him sideways, evaluating him with the coldness of someone who calculates profits. Speculator, thought Samuel, recognizing the look. He had seen many like it during the years after the war, when city men bought land from desperate families for pennies. The auction was strangely brief. The auctioneer described the property with the monotony of someone reciting a learned text. 15 acres, 2-bedroom house, stable, water well. Appraised at $3,000, they would begin at $500. The man in the dark suit made no offers, limiting himself to observing with disdain. His presence seemed more that of a witness than a buyer. Samuel offered $10, feeling the absurdity of the figure in his own voice. $10? Repeated the auctioneer as if he had misheard. 12, Samuel corrected, adding everything he carried in his pocket. The auctioneer looked at the man in the suit, who simply shook his head and consulted his pocket watch. After an uncomfortable silence, the hammer struck the wooden surface. Sold for $12 to the gentleman in the brown hat. While signing the documents with hands that tried not to tremble, Samuel felt growing unease. Something didn't fit. No one sold 15 acres for $12, not even the most desperate bank. "Is there any problem with the property?" he finally asked. The auctioneer closed his briefcase with a definitive snap. The bank recovers its investment. What you do with it and what you find there is your business. Those words resonated in Samuel's mind as he rode west, with the deed folded next to the newspaper clipping. What you find there. As if the land kept a secret that nobody wanted to name. The path serpentined between scrawny oaks and thorny bushes, ascending gently to a hill from where the valley could be seen. Samuel stopped his horse at the summit, observing what now belonged to him. A wooden house with a gabled roof, a barn leaning as if surrendering to time, fallen fences, and a windmill turning lazily. Around, the land showed signs of abandonment. Tall grass, a withered orchard, an empty corral. But what caught his attention was the figure sitting on the front gallery. A woman dressed completely in black, motionless like a statue of sorrow carved in the golden light of dusk. As he approached, details emerged from the distance. A young face framed by brown hair gathered austerely, hands holding something in her lap, a book perhaps, and a posture that spoke of dignity, grasped with teeth and nails. At the sound of hooves, she lifted her gaze. Her eyes, the exact color of dark honey, fixed on him with a mixture of pain and defiance that forced him to slow his pace. Samuel dismounted at a respectful distance, led Thunder by the reins, and stopped at the foot of the 3 steps leading to the gallery. "Good afternoon, madam," he greeted, removing his hat. "I'm Samuel Harrison." The woman didn't respond immediately. Her fingers tensed over what Samuel now identified as an embroidered handkerchief. "I know who you are," she finally said, with a voice clear but tense as violin string. "The man who bought my home for $12. There was no accusation in her words, only a statement of facts that hurt more for its simplicity. "I didn't know someone lived here," Samuel responded, feeling that each word was inadequate. A bitter smile briefly curved the woman's lips. "Isabella Morgan," she introduced herself, "or what remains of her." The silence that followed was so dense that Samuel could hear the beating of his own heart. The woman, Isabella, studied him with the gaze of someone who had learned to read intentions in faces. He remained still, allowing that scrutiny. "Have you come to take immediate possession, Mr. Harrison?" she finally asked. "I've come to know what I bought," he responded with honesty, "and it seems there's more than they told me." Isabella stood then, and Samuel noticed that her black dress, though simple, was impeccably clean and mended with invisible stitches. It wasn't the neglected mourning of someone who had given up, but the dignity of someone clinging to what remained. "Then you'd better come in," she said, heading toward the door. "The light won't last much longer, and there's a story you should know before deciding my fate." The interior of the house was a study in chiaroscuro. Furniture worn but polished with beeswax, mended curtains that filtered the evening light. A silent wall clock with hands stopped at 4:17. Everything spoke of a home that refused to die. Isabella lit an oil lamp with precise movements, illuminating a pine table where 2 cups waited, as if she had anticipated the visit. She served coffee from a pot kept warm on the small iron stove. "I'm not a widow, Mr. Harrison," she said abruptly while offering him a cup, "though I dress as one." Samuel accepted the coffee, observing how she sat across from him, with her back straight and hands now quiet on the table. "William Thompson and I were engaged for 3 years," she continued, her voice acquiring the cadence of someone who has rehearsed a painful story. "He was a horse trainer. The best Brazos had ever known," they said. Her eyes drifted to a framed photograph above the fireplace, a young man next to a black horse, smiling with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. "The bank lent us money to buy more land, expand the business," she continued. "William had plans. He always had plans." The way she pronounced that last phrase contained both love and reproach. 4 months ago, an Sorrel colt knocked him down during training. He hit his head against a fence post. He died before nightfall. Samuel remained silent. No words could adequately respond to such a revelation. Then came the letters, Isabella continued, and her voice acquired a subtle edge. "Gambling debts. Loans he never mentioned. It seems my fiancé had more secrets than plans." The lamplight drew shadows under her cheekbones, accentuating a beauty that pain had made deeper. Like well water. The bank waited exactly 3 weeks after the funeral. Then they came for everything. Now Samuel understood the strange auction, the brief announcement, the auctioneer's look. They weren't just selling a property. They were washing their hands of a woman and her tragedy, "Don't you have family who could help you?" he asked, knowing the question might be an intrusion. Isabella drank a sip of coffee before responding. "My father died at Vicksburg during the war. My mother didn't survive the following winter. My brother is somewhere in California if he's still alive." There was no self-pity in her account, only the acceptance carved by years of losses. "Tomorrow at noon I'll leave," she concluded. "There's a position as a seamstress in Mr. Watson's store in town. It will allow me to rent a room." Samuel contemplated his coffee cup, then the woman in front of him. In her eyes he saw something he recognized too well, the pride that survives when everything else has been lost. "Miss Morgan," he finally said, "I think we should talk about other possibilities." Night had spread its starry mantle over the house when Samuel, sitting on the gallery, contemplated the crescent moon. Isabella had offered him the barn to spend the night, firmly refusing his suggestion that he sleep in the house while she continued occupying it. The rules of decorum were maintained even in ruin. The words he had shared with her reverberated in his mind like distant bells. "I know what it's like to lose land. I know what it's like for others to decide your destiny." While lighting a cigarette, letting the smoke mix with the fresh night air, memories emerged from the corners where he had confined them for decades. His father, a tall and quiet man signing papers with trembling hands. His mother, silently crumbling while packing the few belongings they were allowed to take. He himself, at 16, swearing with adolescent fervor that someday he would recover what was lost. Life had taken his oath down unexpected paths. He never recovered the family land, but learned to read the value of others. He became an expert in judging what others possessed, always passing through, always as an observer. The sound of the door pulled him from his reflections. Isabella came out to the gallery, now wearing a shawl over her shoulders. The silvery moonlight softened her face, momentarily blurring the marks that pain had left on it. "You should rest, Miss Morgan," said Samuel, crushing the cigarette against the sole of his boot. "Sleep and I are not good companions lately," she responded, sitting in the rocking chair where he had found her that afternoon. "Besides, you haven't told me why a cattle inspector suddenly decides to become a farmer." The perceptiveness of the observation surprised him. Isabella Morgan was more observant than he had supposed. 15 years is enough time to get tired of the roads," he admitted, looking toward the dark horizon. "I started dreaming of planting something I could see grow. And why here? Why this land?" The question floated between them like a leaf on water. Samuel considered several answers before choosing simple truth. "I don't know." That appeared. Something resonated. Isabella nodded slightly, as if the answer, in all its inexplicable simplicity, made perfect sense to her. "Your offer is generous, Mr. Harrison," she said after a moment, "but also confusing. Returning the deed with the only condition that I accept your partnership to rebuild the property. What do you really expect from me?" The question was loaded with the natural distrust of someone who had seen promises turn to ashes. Samuel looked at her directly, knowing that any answer less than honest would be detected immediately. "I expect the same thing I offer, a new beginning. I have knowledge of cattle and hands willing to work. You know this land and have reasons to love it. It seems like a fair exchange to me." The night breeze swayed Isabella's loose hair, which now fell like a dark curtain over her shoulders. For an instant she seemed younger, less marked by pain. "Men always want something more, Mr. Harrison." "Men, perhaps," he responded. "I just want a place to call my own before it's too late." The silence that followed was like deep water, full of invisible currents. Finally, Isabella stood up, adjusting her shawl around her shoulders. "I'll think about it tonight," she said. "I'll give you my answer with daylight." As he watched her disappear behind the door, Samuel understood that regardless of her decision, something had begun to change between them. A seed of possibility had been planted in the arid soil of their respective solitudes. Dawn arrived in tones of pearl and pale gold, dispelling the shadows that clung to the valley's corners. Samuel, who had slept little on the barn straw, came out to greet the new day with the uncertainty of someone awaiting a verdict. He found Isabella by the well, drawing water with movements that spoke of years of routine. The morning light revealed details that the previous afternoon had hidden. An abandoned orchard, but with recognizable structure. Scrawny chickens pecking in a neglected yard. Fruit trees pruned with care despite the general abandonment. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she greeted, without interrupting her task. "Good morning, Miss Morgan," he responded, approaching to take the heavy bucket from her hands. She allowed it, a small gesture that he interpreted as a good omen. "I've been awake since 4, Isabella commented, drying her hands on the apron she now wore over her black dress. "Thinking about your proposal." Samuel waited, understanding the magnitude of the decision for her. It wasn't just a matter of land and roofs. It was a bet on human nature, on the possibility of trusting again. "Before answering you," she continued, "I need to know more about you. Not about the cattle inspector, but about the man." The request took him by surprise. He had spent so much time defining himself by his trade that the distinction seemed almost strange. "What do you want to know?" Isabella looked at him with that intensity that seemed to pierce surfaces. "Why has a man like you never put down roots until now? Men your age usually have families, responsibilities." The question, in its direct simplicity, opened a door that Samuel kept closed even to himself. "I was married," he finally responded, "a long time ago, to Mary Beth Turner from Nacogdoches." Something changed in Isabella's gaze, as if she had confirmed a suspicion. What happened? "She found that a Houston merchant offered more security than a man who chased the horizon," he said, without bitterness in his voice, just a statement of facts. "I can't blame her. I promised her stability and gave her absences." The morning wind rustled the tree branches, creating a whisper that filled the silence between them. "My father used to say that land is the only promise that can't be broken, if one cares for it properly," Samuel added. "I think I finally understand what he meant." Isabella nodded slightly, as if recognizing a shared truth. Then, with a decisive gesture, she pointed toward the house. "The kitchen roof leaks when it rains. The well pump needs to be repaired before winter. The north fence is completely down and coyotes are taking the chickens." Samuel contained a smile, understanding what was happening. She was enumerating challenges, not problems. She was accepting his proposal in her own way. "I can fix all that," he assured. "The bank will come to watch us," she continued. "They won't believe in our partnership. They'll think it's some kind of deception to evade the debt. I'll let the papers and the work speak for us." Isabella took a deep breath. Like someone preparing to dive into unknown waters. "I accept your proposal, Mr. Harrison, but with one additional condition. I'm listening. This will be a true partnership. Shared work, shared decisions, mutual respect." Her eyes shone with determination. "I won't be a servant on my own land, nor a charity case to calm your conscience." The firmness of her words awakened in Samuel a respect that went beyond courtesy. "You have my word," he responded, extending his hand. Isabella hesitated an instant before shaking it. Her hand was smaller than his, but equally calloused from work. When their palms met, something invisible was sealed between them, a pact older than any written contract. "Then let's begin, Mr. Harrison," she said, releasing his hand. "There's much to rebuild." October arrived with fresh winds that stripped golden leaves from the trees. During the weeks following their agreement, the property began to awaken from its lethargy, like an organism recovering circulation. Samuel repaired what time and abandonment had deteriorated, while Isabella restored domestic order with meticulous dedication. That morning, Samuel worked on the north fence, driving new posts into the reddish earth. The sun warmed his back as he hammered with rhythmic blows that resonated in the valley. From that position he could see Isabella in the orchard, kneeling between newly traced furrows, planting seeds with the precision of someone who trusts in future fruits. The contrast between what they had found and what they were creating became more evident each day. The well now extracted clear and abundant water, thanks to the new pump Samuel had installed. The barn, reinforced with oak beams, already housed 2 dairy cows they had bought in town. The chickens, protected by repaired fences, were beginning to fatten and increase their egg production. But beyond the physical improvements, something more subtle was taking shape. A shared routine had emerged naturally between them. Silent but comfortable breakfasts at dawn, separate but coordinated work during the day, and dinners where words began to flow with growing ease. Samuel drove in the last post and straightened to contemplate his work. The fence extended straight and firm to the edge of the oak grove. Satisfied, he gathered his tools and headed toward the house for lunch. On the porch he found a pitcher of lemonade and a plate covered with a clean cloth. The gesture, simple but thoughtful, provoked in him a warmth that had no relation to the midday sun. He sat on the steps, drinking the fresh lemonade while observing Isabella, who was now gathering herbs from a small medicinal garden she had begun next to the kitchen. The transformation in her was subtle but undeniable. Although she continued wearing black, she had added small touches of color: a blue handkerchief tied around her neck, an apron with colorful embroidery. Her posture had become less rigid, and occasionally Samuel caught fragments of melodies she hummed while working, as if music was finding its way back into her life. When Isabella approached, drying her hands on her apron, Samuel noticed she wore something hanging around her neck, a small silver locket that shone against the dark fabric of her dress. "It's beautiful work you've done with the fence," she commented, sitting at some distance on the same step. "It should resist even the most persistent coyotes," he responded, finishing his lemonade. A comfortable silence settled between them, the kind that doesn't need to be filled with words. The wind gently stirred the tall grass, creating waves like those of an invisible lake. "I was thinking," Isabella finally said, "that we could buy some sheep the next time we go to town. The eastern pasture is perfect for them." Samuel looked at her with surprise. It was the first time she proposed an expansion, a plan that looked beyond mere survival. "It's an excellent idea," he responded. "My father raised sheep. I know their management well." Something like a smile softened Isabella's features. "My mother spun wool. She taught me before—" Her voice stopped but recovered quickly. "I could make blankets for winter. Maybe even sell some at Mr. Watson's store." The mention of future plans, of creation and not just reconstruction, marked a turning point that both seemed to recognize without needing to name it. "May I ask about the locket?" Samuel inquired, pointing to the silver piece. Isabella's fingers instinctively touched the small object. "It was my mother's," she responded. "Inside there's a lock of my father's hair. She always wore it, even after receiving the news from Vicksburg." The gesture of sharing that personal information was like opening a small window to a private garden. "I have something that might interest you," said Samuel, standing up. "Wait a moment." He returned from the barn with an object wrapped in a handkerchief. Upon unwrapping it, he revealed a knife with an antler handle and a worn but well-sharpened blade. "My father used it for everything, from cutting rope to carving wooden figures," he explained, offering it to her. "I thought it might be useful in the orchard." Isabella took the knife with reverence, recognizing the value it had beyond its practical utility. It was an offering of memory, a bridge between shared though different pasts. "I'll take good care of it," she promised, running her thumb over the handle polished by years of use. When their gazes met, something inexpressible but profound crossed the space between them. It wasn't just a tool that had changed hands, but a part of personal history, a fragment of trust. "We should finish our tasks before evening falls," she finally said, breaking the moment with the practicality that characterized her. "It looks like it might rain tonight." As they separated to continue their respective labors, both carried with them the certainty that something had been built that day, something more essential than fences and orchards, a bridge over the abyss of their solitudes. November's first rains transformed the landscape into a watercolor of ochres and deep greens. The earth, grateful, absorbed each drop like a fulfilled promise. Inside the house, fire crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the newly whitewashed walls. Isabella, sitting in a chair by the hearth, reviewed accounts in a leather-covered notebook. Each number, each calculation, represented a small triumph over adversity. The sale of eggs and cheese in town had begun to generate modest income. The 4 sheep they had bought were adapting well to the eastern pasture. The firewood reserve for winter grew constantly, thanks to Samuel's tireless work. Thinking of him provoked a confusion in her that she struggled to keep at bay. During weeks of shared work, his presence had become as natural as the air she breathed. His silences, initially uncomfortable, were now woven with a familiarity that disconcerted her. The sound of the door interrupted her reflections. Samuel entered, shaking moisture from his hair and jacket. "The rain is getting stronger," he commented, hanging his hat on the rack by the entrance. "But the new roof gutter works perfectly." Isabella closed her notebook and invited him to approach the fire with a gesture. "I've prepared coffee," she said, standing to serve 2 cups from the pot, kept warm at one end of the fireplace. While pouring the dark liquid, she was aware of Samuel's gaze upon her. It wasn't an inappropriate or intrusive look, but attentive, as if trying to memorize each of her movements. "The accounts show improvement," she commented, handing him a cup. "If we continue like this, by spring we can afford a pair of workhorses." Samuel nodded, receiving the coffee with a gesture of gratitude. "I've been thinking about that," he responded. "There's a Percheron mare at the Henderson farm that could serve us well. She has good character and is used to the plough." The use of "could serve us" didn't go unnoticed by Isabella. The language of collaboration had settled between them naturally, without either forcing it consciously. Outside, rain beat the windows with growing intensity. The world seemed to have shrunk to that room lit by fire, to that moment suspended between day and night. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Harrison?" said Isabella, breaking a silence that had extended comfortably. "Of course. After." "Mary Beth," she pronounced the name with some hesitation. "Did you never consider marrying again?" The question, formulated with simplicity, floated between them like a leaf in a pond. Samuel contemplated his coffee before responding. "I considered it once," he admitted. "In San Antonio about 8 years ago. Margaret Wilson, a rancher's daughter. She was intelligent, kind, beautiful." Isabella felt an inexplicable pang at the description. "I proposed marriage." She accepted. Samuel paused, looking at the flames. 3 days later, I told her I couldn't do it. That it wasn't fair to offer her a life with a man who continued chasing something he couldn't even name. The honesty of the confession moved Isabella. She recognized in it the same integrity that had guided each of his actions since she'd known him. "And you, Miss Morgan?" he asked in turn. "Before William—" "No," she responded promptly. "William was my first and only fiancé," Samuel nodded, as if the answer confirmed something he already knew. He must have been an exceptional man. Isabella looked at the fire, where flames slowly consumed the logs, transforming them into light and heat. "He was in many ways," she finally said, "brave, determined, full of dreams, but he was also impulsive. He made decisions without consulting, assumed risks that affected us both." It was the first time she allowed a criticism of William to escape her lips. The confession surprised her as much as it seemed to surprise Samuel. "The debts," he murmured. "The debts, yes. But not just that," she continued, finding that words now flowed like freed water. "He postponed our marriage with each new project, each new idea. 3 years of engagement, Mr. Harrison. 3 years waiting for the right moment." Her eyes moistened. "But it wasn't a cry of sorrow, but of liberation." "I loved him," she affirmed with a firm voice. "But sometimes I wonder if he loved his dreams more than our life together." The confession hung in the air, like the aroma of coffee and burned wood. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, underlining the intensity of the moment. "My father used to say that true love isn't blind," said Samuel softly. "It sees clearly but chooses to love despite what it sees." Isabella felt something unknot inside her at those words. The possibility of loving William with open eyes, recognizing both his virtues and his defects, seemed to free a weight she had carried without knowing it. "Thank you for listening to me," she said, with a voice bare, audible over the sound of rain. "Thank you for trusting me," he responded. When their gazes met across the space that separated them, Isabella was conscious of a truth that had been forming silently during weeks. Samuel Harrison had become much more than a partner in rebuilding a property. He had become witness and guardian of her rebirth as a woman. December brought cold winds that blew from the north, bringing occasional light snowfalls that covered the valley with an ephemeral white mantle. The house, now with all its leaks repaired and windows sealed against drafts, had become a warm refuge against winter's harshness. The routine had solidified between them, with the naturalness of a river finding its course. In the morning, Samuel tended the cattle while Isabella prepared breakfast. During the day, each attended to their responsibilities, occasionally meeting for consultations or to briefly share the kitchen's warmth. At dusk, dinner became a ritual of measured words and comfortable silences. That Sunday afternoon, however, the routine had been altered. A trip to town had allowed them to attend the Sunday service in the small wooden church. For Isabella, it had been the first time since William's funeral that she presented herself before the community. For Samuel, the first time in years he sat in a church pew with something like a purpose. The curious looks, barely disguised murmurs, the excessive cordiality of Reverend Thomas. Everything had confirmed what they already knew. Their arrangement was the object of speculation. Miss Morgan and her partner, as they referred to them with a tone suggesting incredulity, represented an enigma for the town's conventional mentality. Now, back at the property, Isabella found herself in the parlor, knitting by the fire. Her fingers worked the wool from their own sheep, transforming it into a blanket with intricate patterns. The repetitive rhythm of the needles helped her process the emotions the day had awakened. Samuel entered, carrying firewood for the fireplace. His presence, which once seemed to occupy too much space, now slid into the room with the familiarity of the everyday. He arranged the logs by the hearth and sat in the armchair facing her, taking from his pocket a small piece of wood and his pocket knife. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but the type that arises when words become secondary. The soft clicking of knitting needles intertwined with the sound of the knife cutting wood, creating a domestic melody. "Mrs. Peterson seemed especially interested in our situation," Isabella finally commented, without lifting her gaze from her knitting. Samuel smiled slightly while shaping what appeared to be a small animal figure. "Reverend Thomas, too," he responded. "He asked me directly about my intentions." Isabella momentarily stopped her hands, surprised by the revelation. "What did you tell him?" "That my intentions were exactly what I had declared from the beginning, to work this land in fair partnership with you." The simplicity of the response, so characteristic of him, provoked in Isabella a sense of security that had become increasingly frequent in his presence. "Widow Simmons invited me to her sewing circle," she commented, resuming her work. "She said that a woman in my situation needed proper company." Samuel's smile widened as he carefully carved what was now distinguishable as a horse's head. "Will you go?" "I don't think so," she responded. "I have enough sewing here, and the company doesn't displease me." The words escaped before she could contain them, and she felt a warm blush rise up her neck. Samuel, however, showed no reaction beyond a slight nod. The fire crackled in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows over both of them. Outside, wind whistled through the bare trees, but inside, warmth created a world apart, a space where time seemed to flow with different cadence. Isabella observed Samuel while he worked. His hands, large and calloused, moved with surprising delicacy over the wood. She had discovered his talent for carving weeks ago, when she found him creating a bird feeder with scrapboards. Since then, small figures had begun to appear throughout the house. An owl on the mantel, a rabbit by the clock, a fox on the windowsill. "What are you carving this time?" she asked, leaning slightly to see better. "A horse," he responded, turning the small figure to show her the progress. "I thought you might like to have it." The gesture, simple but loaded with consideration, touched something deep in Isabella. It was an offering without expectations, a gift born from attentive observation of her tastes and preferences. "It's beautiful," she said, and her voice sounded softer than she intended. Their gazes met over their respective labors, and something indefinable but powerful crossed the space between them. It wasn't the first time it happened. These moments when the air seemed charged with different energy, like before a storm, Isabella was the first to look away, returning to concentrate on her knitting with renewed intensity. But the sensation persisted, like a musical note that continues vibrating after fingers abandon the strings. "Sometimes I wonder," said Samuel after a long silence, "what would have happened if I had seen that ad a day later, or if I had decided not to attend the auction." The hypothetical question floated between them, loaded with implications. "I would be sewing in a rented room in town," she responded, following the thread of reflection. "And you would still be traveling through other people's ranches. And we would both still be alone," he concluded. The word "alone" resonated in the room with particular intensity. It wasn't a complaint or accusation, but recognition of a shared truth. The loneliness both had known, and that somehow they had begun to unlearn together. Isabella let her hands rest on the dark blue wool she was knitting. The pattern under her fingers represented intertwined stars, a night sky captured in fiber and patience. "I don't regret accepting your proposal, Mr. Harrison," she said with a clear voice. "Not a single day." The confession, simple but profound, transformed something in Samuel's face. A tension that had always been present, so constant it had become invisible, seemed to dissolve, nor I of having made it. "Miss Morgan," he responded. When they returned to their respective tasks, the silence between them had acquired new meaning. It was no longer simply the absence of words, but a language of its own, woven with the invisible threads of mutual understanding and respect that had flourished between them. January arrived with a snowstorm that covered the valley for 3 days, isolating the property from the rest of the world. The immaculate white extended as far as the eye could see, transforming the familiar landscape into an unknown and beautiful territory. Isabella found herself in the kitchen, kneading bread with rhythmic and precise movements. Flour covered her hands like pale gloves, while she worked the dough with the vigor that good country bread required. The aroma of freshly made coffee permeated the air, mixing with the warmth emanating from the wood stove. Through the window, she could see Samuel in the stable, a dark figure against the blinding white, tending the animals with the dedication that characterized him. During the storm days, he had established a path between the house and stable, clearing snow with shovel and determination to ensure the cattle were fed and protected. Watching him work had become a habit for her, though she would never admit it openly. There was something comforting in the solidity of his presence, in the certainty of his movements. It was like an anchor in a world that for so long had seemed adrift to her. The change in her feelings toward him had been gradual, almost imperceptible, like the transition from autumn to winter. She couldn't point to an exact moment when gratitude transformed into respect, respect into affection, and affection into something deeper she still didn't dare name. The door opened, bringing with it a gust of cold air and Samuel, who shook snow from his boots before entering completely. "The animals are fine," he reported, hanging his heavy coat by the door. "I've reinforced the stable roof in case the snow keeps accumulating." Isabella nodded, continuing with her task. The silence that followed was comfortable, the type that only develops with prolonged coexistence. "I've been thinking," said Samuel, approaching to serve himself a cup of coffee, "that when spring comes we could expand the corral. The sheep will need more space when the lambs arrive. The use of "we could," the long-term planning, the assumption of a shared future, all of it provoked in Isabella a sensation of vertigo, as if she were on the edge of something vast and unexplored. "I was also thinking of planting more fruit trees on the south slope," she responded, surprising herself by following the thread of a joint future. "Apple trees and maybe some plum trees." Samuel looked at her over the rim of his cup, and something in his eyes made Isabella look away. Suddenly conscious of the flour on her cheeks and the hair that had escaped from her bun, "Trees that won't bear fruit for years," he commented, with a tone that contained an unformulated question. "The best projects require patience," she responded, kneading the dough with more force. "Yes, and necessary." Silence returned to settle between them, but now charged with different tension, like air before an electrical storm. "Isabella," said Samuel, and the use of her first name, without the usual Miss Morgan, made her look up surprised. "There's something I must tell you." The formality of the phrase activated an alarm inside her. For months they had navigated in delicate balance, a dance of appropriate proximity and distance. Was he about to break that balance? "I'm listening," she responded, trying to make her voice sound firm while shaping the dough, now converted into a round loaf. Samuel left his cup and approached the table where she worked. His proximity made Isabella's heart accelerate in a way she couldn't attribute to the effort of kneading. "I've received a letter from Henderson, the rancher from San Antonio," he began. "He's offering me a job as foreman on his property. Good salary, stable position." The words fell like stones in Isabella's stomach. Her mind immediately constructed the image of the empty house again, of loneliness returning like an old acquaintance, of mornings without the sound of his boots on the porch. "I understand," she said, because it was all she could say while fighting against the knot forming in her throat. "It's a good opportunity." "It is," he confirmed. "In other circumstances." Something in his tone made Isabella look up. Samuel observed her with an intensity that pierced her like lightning. "I wrote to him this morning, rejecting his offer," he continued. "I told him I have commitments here that I cannot and do not wish to abandon." The confession hung between them like snowflakes in still air. Isabella felt her hands tremble slightly as she processed what she had just heard. "Why?" she asked, and the word contained all the questions she didn't dare formulate completely. Samuel took another step toward her, shortening the physical distance as prelude to a deeper revelation. "Because in these months I've discovered something that 15 years on the roads didn't teach me," he said with a grave voice. That a home isn't just a roof and walls. It's the person you share it with. The declaration, direct and without ornaments like everything about him, disarmed the defenses Isabella had carefully constructed. The fear of trusting, of feeling again, of risking another loss, now faced the undeniable evidence of what had grown between them. "Samuel," she responded, using his first name for the first time. "I don't know if I'm ready." "I'm not asking for anything you're not willing to give," he interrupted gently. "I just wanted you to know why I'm staying, why I'll continue here, building fences, planting trees whose fruits I might not see ripen." The naked honesty of his words awakened in Isabella a courage she thought lost. With hands still covered in flour, she reached for the locket hanging from her neck, opened it, and extracted the small lock of hair she had kept as a relic. "For months, I've carried the past with me," she said, showing the now empty locket, "like an anchor that kept me in a safe place but immobile." With a deliberate gesture, she deposited the lock on the table and closed the empty locket. "William left me with dreams I never lived," she continued, each word firmer than the last. "But you remind me I'm still alive. I don't want to be just a memory. I want to be a woman who chooses her path." The declaration, born from months of silent transformation, illuminated Samuel's face like sunrise. Slowly, as if giving time for possible retreat, he extended his hand until it touched Isabella's cheek, leaving a slight flower mark in its passage. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. For all response, Isabella shortened the distance between them. The kiss was tentative at first, like the first step on thin ice, but soon deepened with the intensity of long-contained emotions. Her hands, still covered in flour, left white marks on Samuel's shirt, tangible traces of a moment of transformation. When they finally separated, the kitchen seemed to have changed, as if light entered differently through the windows, as if the air were clearer, cleaner. "The bread will burn," she murmured, with a smile that hadn't appeared on her face for too long. "There's more flour," he responded, drawing her toward him again. Outside, the sun began to peek through the clouds, making the snow shine like millions of tiny diamonds. A new day had begun, not just in the sky but also inside the small house, where two solitudes had just found a common language. February brought gradual thawing. Snow slowly retreated, revealing the moist and promising earth beneath. In town, however, not all frosts had yielded. Isabella walked through the general store aisles with a carefully prepared list. Seeds for early planting, fabric for new curtains, sugar, coffee, nails for spring repairs. While selecting what was needed, she was conscious of the looks and murmurs that followed her like persistent shadows. "Good morning, Miss Morgan," greeted Mrs. Peterson with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Or should I say Mrs. Harrison? The question, formulated with feigned innocence, contained the poison of speculation that had circulated through town since Isabella and Samuel had begun to be seen not just as business partners, but as something more. "It's still Miss Morgan, Mrs. Peterson," responded Isabella with a calm she didn't feel. "As you well know," the older woman clicked her tongue in a gesture that mixed disapproval and false concern. "A single woman living with a man without kinship or marriage, it's not what one would expect from someone raised in a respectable family like yours." "Dear," Isabella gripped the bag of seeds she held, fighting the impulse to defend herself. Mrs. Peterson's words were nothing more than the verbalization of what the whole town whispered, that the arrangement between her and Samuel had transcended the professional, and that this made her an object of scandal. "I appreciate your concern," she finally responded, placing the seeds in her basket. "But my personal affairs are precisely that, personal." Before the woman could respond, Mr. Watson, the store owner, approached with the package of nails Isabella had requested. "Here you are, Miss Morgan," he said, handing her the package. "Anything else from the list?" The shopkeeper's intervention, who had always shown respect toward her, provided the necessary escape. Isabella completed her purchases quickly and went out to the main street where Samuel waited by the wagon. "Everything all right?" he asked, noticing her tense expression while loading the purchases. "The town has very defined opinions about us," she responded. Climbing into the wagon, Samuel took the reins and set the vehicle in motion before responding. "Does what they say worry you?" The question floated between them as they left behind the town's last houses. Isabella observed the landscape that was beginning to show signs of spring. green shoots on trees, wildflowers timidly appearing among the renewing grass. "I'm worried about how it might affect us," she finally admitted. "Business sales in town. They can talk," said Samuel with his characteristic serenity. "But they'll keep buying our products because they're good. Mrs. Peterson can disapprove of our arrangement, but she'll still want your butter and fresh eggs." The observation, practical and direct, drew a smile from Isabella. It was typical of him to reduce problems to their essential elements, stripping them of unnecessary complications. "Besides," he added, glancing at her sideways, "there's always a simple solution if the rumors bother you too much." Isabella looked at him with curiosity. "Which one?" "We could make them true," he responded with a contained smile. "Marry me, Isabella." The proposition, formulated with the same naturalness with which he would have suggested planting corn in the south plot, left Isabella speechless. It wasn't the first time they had spoken of marriage. Since that kiss in the kitchen, their relationship had evolved toward an intimacy that made the idea seem the logical next step. However, hearing it expressed with such simplicity, in the middle of the dusty road, with the wagon swaying gently beneath them, moved her deeply. "Are you asking me to marry you to silence the town's rumors?" she asked, trying to make her voice sound light despite the emotion that overwhelmed her. Samuel stopped the wagon at a bend in the road where a stream crossed under a small wooden bridge. He turned toward her, and his eyes revealed a seriousness that contrasted with the casual tone of his proposal. "I'm asking you to marry me because I love you," he said, with the same direct honesty with which he had confessed every important truth. That the town stops talking would just be an additional benefit. The declaration, so simple yet so profound, touched something fundamental in Isabella. For months they had built together, fences, corrals, routines. They had shared meals, conversations, silences. Love had grown between them like the seeds they planted, nourished by daily work and mutual trust. "Yes," she responded, with a voice she barely recognized as her own. "I'll marry you, Samuel Harrison." The smile that illuminated his face was like sun emerging after storm. Without additional words, he took her hand and kissed it with reverence that spoke of promises that this time would be fulfilled. When the wagon resumed motion, Isabella experienced a sensation of freedom she had never known before. The town's whispers, disapproving looks, others' opinions, everything seemed to diminish before the certainty she had found in Samuel's eyes. The road to the property, their shared home, had never seemed so full of possibilities. The land on both sides was beginning to awaken from winter lethargy, preparing for a new cycle of life. And she, Isabella Morgan, was doing exactly the same thing. The small wooden church in Brazos was decorated with simplicity for the occasion. Freshly cut wildflowers in glass vases, white ribbons at the ends of pews, and evening light filtering through narrow windows, creating golden patterns on the board floor. It wasn't the wedding Isabella had imagined during her years of engagement to William, but as she looked at herself in the mirror of the church's back room, she recognized it was exactly the ceremony she wanted now. Her dress wasn't white or new, a pale blue like spring sky. It had been made by her own hands during the last weeks in quiet nights by the fire. She wore no veil but a crown of small flowers woven in her gathered hair. Around her neck, the empty locket, now a symbol not of what she had lost, but of the freedom to choose again. The door opened softly, and the Reverend's wife, Mrs. Thomas, peeked in with a kind smile. "They're ready, dear," she announced. "And let me tell you, I've never seen a man more nervous and happy at the same time." The image of Samuel waiting at the altar, probably tugging at the collar of his new shirt, made Isabella smile. In the 6 months since that proposal on the road, their relationship had flourished into an intimacy that went beyond the physical. They had learned to read each other, to anticipate needs, to share spaces without unnecessary words. Marriage seemed almost a formality, the public confirmation of something that already existed in essence. "I'm ready," she responded, taking the small bouquet of wildflowers resting on the table. When Mrs. Thomas withdrew, Isabella remained another moment before the mirror. At 30 years old, her face showed the maturity of someone who had known both loss and rebirth. She wasn't the virginal bride she had planned to be for William, but a woman who had learned that endings can also be beginnings. "Thank you," she murmured, and she wasn't sure if she was speaking to God, fate, or her own heart for having found the courage to trust again. The ceremony was brief and devoid of unnecessary pomp. Reverend Thomas, with his characteristic simple eloquence, spoke of second chances and firm foundations. The congregation was small. Some neighbors who had overcome initial gossip, Mr. Watson and his wife, 2 ranchers who appreciated Samuel's knowledge of cattle, and the school teacher, who had always treated Isabella with respect. Notably absent were Mrs. Peterson and her circle of friends, who had made their disapproval clear to the end. But their absence, far from diminishing the moment, seemed to purify it, leaving only authenticity in the small church. When Samuel took her hands to exchange vows, Isabella felt that everything, the past pain, uncertainty, doubts, had been a necessary path to this moment. His eyes, clear and direct as always, transmitted a promise that went beyond the ritual words they pronounced. I, Samuel Harrison, take you, Isabella Morgan, as my lawful wife, to build with you, to honor you with my actions more than with words, to be your companion in abundant harvests and in droughts. The vows, written by himself, reflected the practical yet deeply poetic nature of their love. They weren't promises of perfection or idealized romance, but commitments of shared work, mutual respect, and joint growth. When her turn came, Isabella pronounced the words she had repeated in her mind for days, words that were born not from juvenile fantasies, but from mature understanding of love. I, Isabella Morgan, take you, Samuel Harrison, as my lawful husband, to cultivate with you not only the land but also our hearts, to sustain and be sustained, to build a home that is refuge and not prison. When placing the simple gold ring on her finger, Samuel did so with the same careful precision with which he repaired fences or carved wood. It wasn't a grandiose gesture, but one full of intention and permanence. The kiss that sealed the ceremony was brief but loaded with promise, appropriate for the sacred place but eloquent in its restraint. When they turned toward the small congregation as husband and wife, Isabella felt a quiet but deep joy, like a river that has finally found its natural course. The reception was held in the church's back garden, under an improvised awning and flowering trees. The food was simple but abundant, much of it produced on their own land, cheese from their cows, bread baked with local wheat, fruit preserves from their orchard. While sharing food and conversation flowed with growing naturalness, Isabella observed Samuel speaking animatedly with Mr. Watson about plans to expand cheese production. His solid presence, his direct way of relating, his capacity to genuinely listen, all of it reaffirmed the certainty of her choice. "You look happy," commented Mrs. Watson, approaching with a cup of coffee. "It's good to see you this way after so much time." "I am," confirmed Isabella, accepting the cup. "In a way I didn't think possible again." The older woman nodded with understanding. As the shopkeeper's wife, she had witnessed many of the town's stories, both happy and tragic. Sometimes life gives us exactly what we need, not what we thought we wanted, she said with the wisdom of her 60 well-lived years. And that man looks at you as if you were his north. Dear. When the sun began to set, tinting the sky in deep oranges and roses, the newlyweds climbed into the flower-decorated wagon for the return to their home. Good wishes and rice thrown by guests accompanied them as they departed down the now familiar road. They made the return journey mostly in silence, a comfortable silence full of shared anticipation. The property emerged in the distance, bathed by the day's last golden light. The house with its repaired roof, smoke rising from the chimney they had lit before leaving. The corrals where sheep and cattle waited to be tended. "Home," said Samuel simply. When the wagon crossed their property's boundaries, Isabella took his hand over the reins, feeling the new ring on her finger, tangible symbol of what they had built together. "Home," she repeated, and the word contained an entire future ahead. Summer spread its splendor over the Harrison property, as it was now known in town. The fruit trees, though young, offered their first modest harvest. The cattle, now a herd of 12 head, grazed peacefully in green meadows thanks to spring's generous rains. The orchard overflowed with vegetables, and the beehives Samuel had installed in spring buzzed with constant activity. Isabella, sitting in the shade of the expanded porch, sewed with agile fingers while observing Samuel work on the new corral. Her body had adapted to a different rhythm in recent months, slower yet more conscious of each sensation. Her belly, now noticeably rounded under her loose dress, sheltered the promise they had both created. The pregnancy had been received with quiet joy as a natural continuation of what they had been building. Samuel had responded to the news with silent tears, the first she had seen him shed, followed by even more intense dedication to ensuring everything on the property was safe and comfortable for their future family member. The most significant change, however, had been the transformation of the house's second room. What had been storage space gradually became a nursery, with a crib carved by Samuel's hands and curtains sewn by Isabella with soft-toned fabrics. Town acceptance had also evolved over time. Marriage and pregnancy had legitimized in the community's eyes what had previously been the object of speculation. Mrs. Peterson and her circle continued maintaining certain distance, but most of Brazos inhabitants now treated them with the respect due an established and productive family. "Comfortable?" asked Samuel, approaching the porch to drink water from the bucket she kept cool under the shade. "Comfortable enough," she responded with a smile, setting her sewing aside. "Though this little cowboy seems determined to practice kicks against my ribs." Samuel sat beside her on the double bench he had built, especially so they could contemplate sunsets together. With reverence that never diminished, he placed a hand on her swollen belly, marveling when he felt movement under his palm. "Strong," he commented with palpable pride. "Like his mother." The observation provoked in Isabella a wave of love so intense that for a moment it was difficult to breathe. In little more than a year, her life had taken a complete turn, from loss and uncertainty to fullness and purpose. From being about to become a peripheral figure in town to being the center of a flourishing home. "I've been thinking about names," she said, covering Samuel's hand with hers. "If it's a boy, I'd like to call him William Samuel." The suggestion hung between them. Naming their son partly for the man who had been her fiancé could have caused tension in another marriage, but Samuel simply nodded, understanding the importance of honoring the past while building their future. "It's a good name," he responded, and in his voice there was no doubt or jealousy, only acceptance. "And if it's a girl?" "Margaret Mary," she responded without hesitation. "For your mother and mine." The union of their family histories in their future son or daughter's name symbolized everything they had achieved together. The integration of their individual pasts into a shared narrative, the transformation of pain into honored memory, the creation of something new from what had been lost. The sun began to descend toward the horizon, bathing the property in golden light that transformed the ordinary into extraordinary. Shadows lengthened, and the air filled with the aroma of warm earth, fresh grass, and the roses Isabella had planted by the entrance. "Sometimes I wonder," said Samuel, contemplating his land with reflective expression, "what would have happened if that day I hadn't seen the auction notice in the newspaper." It was a reflection they occasionally shared, this recognition of how apparently loose threads of destiny had woven together to bring them to this point. "I prefer to wonder what will happen tomorrow," responded Isabella, stroking her belly with circular movements. "And the day after, and all the days to come." Samuel smiled, recognizing in her words the future orientation that characterized their relationship. They didn't live anchored in what might have been, but focused on what they were creating together. "Tomorrow I'll finish the corral," he said, following her line of thought, "and begin preparing the land for autumn planting. And perhaps if you have energy, we could ride to the creek in the afternoon." The simple but purposeful planning was his form of love, as eloquent as any poem or grandiose declaration. Isabella nodded, intertwining her fingers with his. "And I'll finish this blanket," she added, pointing to her work, "and prepare preserves with the peaches we picked yesterday, and wait for you under the willow for that ride." The sun touched the horizon, sending its last rays like blessings over the land they had transformed with work and determination. The 15-acre property, acquired for $12 in a strange auction, had become much more than a plot of land. It was tangible testimony of rebirth and possibility. As the first stars began to appear in the gradually darkening sky, Isabella rested her head on Samuel's shoulder, feeling the constant pulse of their shared life, the baby moving in her belly, her husband's steady heart under her hand, the whisper of wind in trees they had planted together. "Happy, Mrs. Harrison?" he asked, kissing her hair tenderly. "At peace," she responded, and it was the deepest truth she knew. September's dawn brought a breeze that announced seasonal change. Tree leaves began showing first golden touches, and dew shone on grass like diamonds scattered by a generous hand. Isabella rocked gently in the chair by the window, contemplating the horizon gradually illuminating. In her arms, wrapped in a blue blanket she had knitted during the last months of waiting, slept William Samuel Harrison, barely 2 weeks old. His arrival had transformed the known world, as if all colors were more intense, all sounds clearer, all emotions deeper. His small face, with features that seemed a perfect mixture of both, had become the center of a redefined universe. The birth had been long but without complications, with the town's midwife and Samuel present throughout the process. When the baby's cry finally filled the room, Isabella had seen in her husband's eyes a reflection of her own overwhelming joy, happiness so pure it was almost painful. The door opened silently, and Samuel entered with a cup of hot tea he placed on the small table beside her. Each morning since the birth, he rose before dawn to tend the animals and return in time for this shared moment, these quiet minutes before the day unfolded its demands. "Did he sleep well?" he asked in a low voice, kneeling beside the chair to observe his son's sleeping face. "Better than the night before," responded Isabella, accepting the cup with her free hand. "I think he's finally finding his rhythm." Samuel caressed the tiny hand that peeked between the blanket's folds, marveling as always at the perfection of those minuscule fingers. "Nails no bigger than poppy seeds. He looks like you when he sleeps," he commented, with a smile that softened the lines of his face weathered by sun and work. "And like you when he screams demanding what he wants," she responded. With the complicity they had developed, the baby stirred briefly before returning to the deep sleep of infancy. Isabella adjusted the blanket around him, feeling a wave of protection so intense it took her breath away. This small being, born from unexpected love that had flourished in lands of loss, represented everything she never knew she could yearn for. Samuel stood and approached the window, contemplating the property spread before them. Well-tended fields, corrals where cattle began to move lazily, the abundant orchard, fruit trees with their first harvests. Everything spoke of constant work, shared dedication, vision made reality. "Exactly 1 year ago," he said, without taking his gaze from the horizon, "I arrived at this property with a deed in my pocket and no idea what I would find." Isabella nodded, vividly remembering that day. She sitting on the porch dressed completely in black, he appearing on the road like a figure emerged from nowhere, the initial exchange loaded with distrust and wariness. 1 year, she repeated, gently rocking her son. "Sometimes it seems like a lifetime, and sometimes it seems barely a breath." Samuel turned toward her, and dawnlight drew his profile with almost poetic clarity. "I was thinking," he said, with that paused cadence he used when something important occupied his mind, "that we could plant a tree for William. An oak, perhaps, something that grows with him, that puts down deep roots like ours." The suggestion, simple but loaded with symbolism, touched something deep in Isabella. It was so characteristic of Samuel to express the most complex feelings through concrete actions. Tangible projects that represented intangible truths. "I'd like that," she responded, imagining the tree growing year after year, marking time's passage, becoming silent witness to their son's life. "We could plant it today." "Today," he confirmed, as if the plan were already in motion in his methodical mind. The baby woke then, opening still unfocused eyes that seemed to instinctively seek the source of familiar voices. His small face contracted briefly before relaxing in an expression that, though doctors would insist was just a reflex, seemed remarkably similar to a smile. "Good morning." "William Samuel," greeted Isabella, bringing him to her chest. "Today we'll plant a tree for you, a tree that will grow strong and tall as we hope you will." While nursing her son, with Samuel now sitting on the chair's arm, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, Isabella reflected on the cycles of loss and renewal that had marked her life. The death of her parents, the loss of William, the threat of losing her home, everything had seemed at the time a definitive ending. And yet each loss had contained within itself the seed of a new beginning, waiting for the right moment, the correct combination of circumstances to germinate. "What are you thinking about?" asked Samuel, perceiving her reflective state. "About circles," she responded, looking at her son, who now observed her with the intense concentration of newborns. "About how things return to the starting point but transformed." Samuel nodded, understanding without need for more explanations. That was one of the blessings of their union, the capacity to follow each other's thoughts without needing detailed maps. When the sun finally emerged completely over the horizon, bathing the room in golden light, the three remained in that perfect moment. Isabella holding her son, Samuel holding both with his constant presence, all three interwoven in a present that honored the past while looking confidently toward the future. Later that day, as they had planned, they planted a young oak on the hill that dominated the property. Samuel excavated the hole with meticulous care, while Isabella held the baby, murmuring to him the names of birds flying by and the promises the future held for him. When the tree was firmly planted in the reddish earth, its roots already seeking depth and stability, Isabella understood with crystal clarity that the true miracle wasn't just the new birth she held in her arms, but also the rebirth she herself had experienced, from eternal bride to real wife, from guardian of memories to creator of futures, from woman about to lose everything to woman who had found more than she ever believed possible. As they returned to the house, with afternoon sun projecting their elongated shadows on the path, 3 shadows where there had once been only one, Isabella thought of the $12 that had changed the course of their lives. 12 coins that in any other circumstance would have barely bought provisions for a week, but that in this case had bought the possibility of a completely new life. "Ready to go in?" asked Samuel, stopping at the foot of the porch steps, the same ness where they had first met. Isabella looked at the house they had transformed together, then at her son sleeping peacefully in her arms, and finally at Samuel, whose face reflected everything she felt without need for elaborate words. "Ready," she responded, and the word contained not only the answer to his immediate question, but also to all the unformulated questions about the future that awaited them. When they crossed the threshold, entering the home they had built, not just with wood and nails, but with trust and second chances, Isabella felt the circle completing itself. Not as an ending, but as the foundation for new beginnings that extended toward an unlimited horizon, as vast and promising as the Texas sky above their heads.